Okay, so this is Chapter 17, Part 1 of the Eric Foner book, Freedom's Boundaries at Home and Abroad. This chapter talks about the plight of the farmers, as well as the segregated South in the latter quarter of the 19th century, or the 1800s. This chapter really specifies that there were two definitions of liberty at the time. There was the employer's definition of liberty that emphasized individual property rights and freedom from any obstacles to do what you wanted. In their case, the freedom to hire and fire and treat workers as they wanted. The employees, however, and the poor in general, specifically farmers, were much more concerned over the loss of economic freedom if employers were allowed to do whatever they wanted. For them, they wanted the government to be involved to regulate the economy so that workers, farmers, miners, and poor people in general would not be exploited by the capitalist system. So what was going on with the farmers at this time that they became so concerned about their liberty because of their economic enslavement? There was falling agricultural prices because of drastic overproduction, and there was a fear that as debt increased, they would eventually lose their land, and losing their land, they would lose any economic independence because they would have to work for others thereafter. The reasons for this problem were many. They blamed the railroad companies that charged too high a price for transportation, they blamed the banks for their high interest loans, and they blamed the government for not allowing more money to circulate in the economy, which would make loans easier to get. Their initial response to these problems is what's known as a farmers' alliance, where farmers got together, they pooled all their resources so that collectively they can go to banks and ask for loans. The banks refused to treat with the farmers as a collective alliance. Next, farmers tried to engage directly with the government, again pooling their resources to ask on the government to make loans to farmers in times of need. Again, this wasn't as successful as they wanted. And so farmers turned to actual political activity. They formed the Populist Party. And in this party, they attracted a wide group of people, all of whom were frustrated with corporate control of the economy and a government that did nothing. This included farmers, miners, and industrial workers. They had a strong grassroots mobilization campaign, holding many meetings, publishing pamphlets, and organizing people around a common vision, specifically that America should be a commonwealth of small producers, and small producers were fundamental to freedom because this way wealth could be distributed amongst a large group of people. They asked for a restoration of democracy and economic opportunity guaranteed by the government, and they wanted an expanded federal government to do this. The Omaha platform for the Populist Party in the 1892 presidential election called for, amongst other things, direct election of senators, the government controlling the currency, not the banks, a graduated income tax, which meant you paid more the more you made, low-cost public financing or loans for farmers, the right of workers to form labor unions, and government ownership of railroads to guarantee cheap freight. This coalition of populists was very broad. It brought together whites and blacks, though it was limited by simple racism. It also involved women, and the populists supported a woman's right to vote. In the 1892 presidential election, their candidate, James Weaver, managed to get 1 million votes, which was significant. They also elected 3 governors and 15 members of Congress. Their appeals to industrial workers did have some success, but also some limitations. For instance, the miners supported them, but the workers in the cities, not so much. The workers in the cities would be hurt by the populist policy of a low tariff, which would increase global free trade. The industrial workers of the cities wanted a high tariff, as promised by the Republican Party, in order to protect American manufacturing jobs. In the presidential election of 1896, the campaign was between William Jennings Bryan, Democrat who also had the populist's support, and the campaign of the Republican William McKinley. The Democrats and populists joined together over the themes of free silver, or the unrestricted minting of silver, in order to increase the money supply and make bank loans cheaper to get. They also wanted an activist government to help the poor. President McKinley, on the other hand, insisted on a gold standard and a very restricted money supply, which made loans expensive. He got tons of support from big business, and ultimately, McKinley was successful. The country divided along regional lines, with McKinley taking the industrial Northeast, the Midwest, and California and Oregon. He got industry workers, financiers, the wealthy in general. Bryan got the South and the West. Thereafter, the Republicans established a dominance in national politics for years to come. The other group that felt, and actually did specifically, lose their freedom and this time was the blacks in the American South. This was a period where blacks faced the imposition of Jim Crow, legalized segregation, and the loss of the power to vote. It began in 1877 with the end of Reconstruction. Reconstruction was a period after the American Civil War where blacks had political power guaranteed to them by the protection of the Army, which occupied the South. After 1877, through a series of intimidation, violence, and murder, black voters were kept away from the polling booths. Black politicians were driven out of Southern politics, and whites, or the Redeemers, took over the governments in the South. The first thing they did was they dismantled the achievements of the Reconstruction era. Public facilities that were built in order to cater to the poor white and specifically black Southern populations were dismantled. Hospitals and asylums built again for poor blacks and whites in the South were closed down. Public education, which was very rare before the American Civil War in the South, was also starved of funding in order to keep blacks as ignorant as possible. While poor whites suffered from these policies, the goal was to turn the majority poor blacks into second-class citizens. Most insidious were prison sentences increased for minor crimes, and so the prison population of mostly blacks exploded. And once in prison, this population was rented out for involuntary labor. It was in fact a new form of slavery. The New South kept people, the majority of its residents, quite poor. There was very little industry in the South. There was a continued dependence on agriculture, cotton, rice, or tobacco. With the prices being low, farmers, even if they owned their own land or were sharecroppers, black and white, but especially blacks in the South, were in a state of continuous poverty. There was no industry, or little industry. There was very little skilled work. And even though there was a vibrant black middle class in the cities, the majority of blacks remained poor, uneducated, with no access to land, and stuck in the South. They had no money to leave, to get out west where land was being given away free or at little cost. And northern industry simply refused to hire blacks until World War I, when all the immigration that northern industry was depending on from Europe was cut off. Black politics in this period drastically declined because of Jim Crow intimidation, segregation, and the Northerners allowing the South to do this. Blacks got into office less and less in the 1880s and 1890s through voter fraud, intimidation, redistricting, eliminating elective offices in black majority districts. Blacks were disenfranchised or the vote taken from them in a variety of ways by the imposition of new state laws in the 1890s, such as the poll tax, or a literacy test having to prove you could read, or having to prove that you understood the state constitution. By 1940, only 3% of Southern blacks were registered to vote. And the North did not stop this. The Senate, with Northern votes, defeated a law to protect black voters in the South, and the Supreme Court upheld these laws, all of these state laws that took voting rights away from Southern blacks. Racial segregation was also proceeded strongly in this period. They were segregated, blacks and whites, in public and private facilities. The Supreme Court allowed for such legal segregation through state laws. Even though there was an 1875 Civil Rights Act which barred segregation, the court overruled that law. In Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, the court ruled that segregation did not violate the 14th Amendment of equality to all citizens. As long as the separate spaces were equal, segregation was allowed, but of course segregation never led to equality, as black facilities were always underfunded. As such, there was a drastic reduction of blacks to second-class status. No voting, no access to lands, no public education, and it reinforced white domination during this period of the Jim Crow South. Even other minority groups were targeted through these restrictive laws. So as blacks were losing voting and equality rights in the South, the Chinese were losing them in California, and the Mexicans in Texas and California. Another consequence of the rise of organized and systemic racism and segregation was lynching, organized mob violence against blacks. All signals in society was that it was okay to treat blacks as non-humans. As such, the mob violence against Southern blacks, and blacks really nationally, but mostly in the South, drastically increased. Between 1880 and 1950, 5,000 blacks were lynched publicly without any punishment from the police, even though they knew what was going on. These pictures show that these lynchings were community events. People came and watched. They brought their wives, husbands, and their children. Another consequence of the rise of back to power of white dominance in the South was that history was rewritten, and it justified white dominance in the South. The Civil War was now written as a family quarrel amongst white Americans. It was no longer being written about as a fight over the issue of slavery, but a fight over the issue of property and of the Union. Reconstruction was written of as a period of horrible black political rule that had to be reversed and fixed, even though this claim was simply incorrect. And blacks were erased from history as historical actors. Their contribution to the Civil War was eliminated in the history books, and it would take until the 1950s, 60s, and 70s for blacks to be rewritten back into American history.